Well, thanks to the altruism of Steve Stearns, despite the fact that we started a little late, we're actually on time. So he's the sort of guy you want to have on your faculty. The last speaker before the break is Caleb Finch, who's a master biologist who's interested in aging, and I had the good fortune, thanks to Kristen Hawkes, who organized a meeting at the School for American Research, to spend several days with Caleb, but he doesn't have his violin here, which
It's a fiddle.
it's a fiddle, I'm sorry. God, I knew I would make a big mistake. Okay.
I'm PC. PC means politically correct. I work at that. So I want to talk about how human lifespan evolved and in relationship to diet and some of the genes that are involved. So here is a scale going back 6 million years up to the present, and here is our life expectancy, and absolutely remarkable change in the last 200 years. On the average, we've added 1 year of life expectancy to every 4 years of historical time. This is almost certainly driven by environment, culture, and technology. I'm not going to focus on that, although some of the same theoretical considerations come into the earlier phase in which we evolved a longer lifespan at some time during the last 6 million years from our shared great ape ancestor, which putatively was shared with chimpanzee. That's what the genetics says. We have no reason to think that that was a very chimpanzee-like creature. But in any case, there was a remarkable transition both in lifespan during this interval and in the nature of the diet. So the diet of the current great apes, chimpanzee is the best documented, is largely based on plant foods with small variable amounts of animal protein that can be in the form of termites. Chimpanzees are famous for termite dipping, and in some populations of chimpanzees they go out and hunt and share meat, but it's safe to say that the total animal protein intake and animal tissue intake, fat intake, is 10% or less than that which is in typical human populations. So at the same time as we were changing to a much more meat-based diet, we increased our longevity, and the paradox is that we have a lot of evidence from experimental animals that fatty-rich diets, elevated blood cholesterol, which are a correlate of that, accelerate a lot of degenerative diseases. And so I'm developing the hypothesis of evolved meat-adaptive genes that allowed in various, undoubtedly complex ways, this remarkable change in diet, and at the same time enabled increases of lifespan. My thinking in this is developed with Robert Sapolsky, who couldn't attend today, unfortunately, and with Craig Stanford. And we wrote some articles together, and I recently summarized my thinking in a book that I published last year. So my sort of larger working hypothesis is that diet and inflammation are major factors in the evolution of the human lifespan by influencing the progression of degenerative diseases, which are known to be sensitive to both nutritional and inflammatory influences. So let's look to see, for example, for Alzheimer's type degeneration, what the phylogenetic representation is. Well, there are very clear examples, very good studies on the mouse lemur, squirrel monkey, rhesus monkey, that they develop some of the same changes that are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease at much earlier ages. And it's remarkable then that in the 12 or so brains from older gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees that have been looked at, that they're really very, very much less subject to the changes that occur earlier in the monkeys and that occur in corresponding life stages of humans to a much greater extent. So we have a possibility that the evolution of Alzheimer-type changes was in some way a major departure from the pongid ancestry. Chimpanzees, by observations, superficial observations, age a lot faster than humans. Here's one of Jane Goodall's famous grandmothers, named Flo, and she really looked pretty beat up at her age 42. No beauty salon would correct this quickly. But at a more fundamental level, the demography of mortality in aging populations clearly shows the much earlier onset of mortality increases in chimpanzees than, for example, in hunter-gatherer populations, which have very limited access to medical technology and vaccination. So I think it's a reasonable first conclusion that demographically mortality patterns indicate much earlier aging, and a little bit of organ pathology that's been available suggests that too. Thinning of bone at age 40. Captive chimps have prostate hypertrophy by the age of 30. So the question is, how do we account for this shift to a meat-rich, fat-rich diet at the same time as adding extending the aging pattern, increasing lifespan? And it's a paradox because in animal models, fatty diets accelerate aging and disease, and caloric restriction, on the other hand, slows it. So let's look at what diet brings into the human system. So there are clear benefits from many perspectives of meat-rich diets. Number one, the nutrients are highly concentrated, and at most levels of physical demand, you can eat all you need for a heavy day's work in 3 or 4 10-minute meals if the food is available. In contrast, most of the great apes spend their waking hours foraging and chewing leaves, and it takes a great deal more effort and time to ingest the equivalent number of calories. Meat is also rich in iron, vitamins, which are not necessarily available in plants. Particularly important, according to Lauren Cordain, and I agree, that they're rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids that are really important for normal brain development. And we have vegan macrobiotic communities which very frequently show developmental retardation from deficiencies in vitamins. So there certainly are many benefits to a meat-rich diet. On the other hand, excess cholesterol and fats accelerate many conditions that would shorten lifespan, and we also have to reckon with the original condition of eating animal tissues, which is that they weren't cooked, or they weren't cooked very well. And of course, animal vertebrates are loaded with parasites. The scavenging of early ancestors would have given them buckets of this, and viruses and prions. So those are counterbalancing effects. So there's also some genetics that I will be bringing into this, which is that modern populations have 2 prevalent alleles of an apolipoprotein gene, and one of them, ApoE4, carriers are at high risk for heart and brain disease, but ApoE4 is the ancestral allele. So another aspect of this, I'm going to give a little bit of data that just supports these. I can't give the whole story. Making transgenic mice with human ApoE3 or 4 as targeted substitutions, it turns out on Western diets that these mice, if they carry ApoE4, develop larger fat cells, and they also have glucose insulin dysregulation. So this is a gene that I think is worth some investment of thought and experiments to understand its relation to the evolution of the human diet and our modern physiology. So here's a cartoon sort of putting some of the technology together that we all know about. Stone tools for scraping and hunting probably are securely documented 2.5 million years ago, as Bernard said. The use of fire in controlled circumstances probably about 500,000 years ago. There are some who argue that it was later. And at about the same time, shafted spears and organized hunting parties turned up. So this is the time frame, all within those latter within the genus Homo. So it's interesting then to look at various candidates that would enable or interact with the shifts in diet, and I want to comment on two of them, one in more detail than the others. The prion genes, which govern the susceptibility to infection with prions known for mad cow disease or kuru, evolved about 500,000 years ago, just when fire and major hunting was becoming established. And if you have a heterozygote for the two alleles, then you are at less risk for transmissible prion disease. So there will be, I think, a number of interesting cases of disease transmission that interact with this whole process. I'm going to say much more now about apolipoprotein E alleles. The E4 allele, which is beneficial for lifespan and resistance to chronic disease, evolved at about 225,000 years ago. The E4 is undatable in its origin, but was the archaic allele in human populations, at least as far as can be determined. So here's a little bit more detail on it, and this comes from work from Charlie Singh's lab and documenting the changes in amino acids. And as best as can be determined, the E3 allele spread in human populations about 225,000 years ago, which predates the working recognition for the anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and puts ApoE4 back further into the origin of our species. And we can't, however, tell when it evolved. Now, the fascinating thing is that the chimpanzee ApoE is predicted to be functionally more like ApoE3 than ApoE4. I don't know what got deleted here, because there's another amino acid change downstream of it that influences its folding such that it would make an ApoE4 molecule functionally like ApoE3 in its physiology and its interaction with receptors and with lipoproteins. So we have the possibility then that chimp ApoE was like ApoE3, and we evolved the ApoE4 in more recent times in genus Homo. So the ApoE alleles are remarkably pleiotropic. They influence many, many different functions. Lifespan, blood cholesterol, inflammatory responses, fat depots and glucose metabolism, the rate of brain aging in the absence of Alzheimer's disease, and I'll also show some stunning data that they influence neuronal development and brain size. Marching through this quickly, here is a modal age at death in ApoE3 versus E4 populations. On the average, the presence of ApoE4 allele shortens lifespan 7 to 8 years. ApoE alleles influence glucose clearance. Here is a mouse experiment with transgenic E3 or E4, and glucose tolerance, insulin tolerance, is much better than the E3. There's recent data published in an article there. In the absence of Alzheimer's disease, cognitive, boy, that's a terrible projection, I'm so sorry. There's dotted lines here representing the ApoE3 versus ApoE4. Bottom line is that ApoE3 carriers have much slower cognitive decline than ApoE4, and it interacts with carotid thickening such that if the thickening of the carotid is greater in E4 and cognitive decline is also greater. At a molecular level, and this is where the story gets quite interesting and will unfold in a very surprising way, the presence of ApoE4 increases lysosomal leakage in the presence of in cells that have the amyloid beta peptide, and this increases the amyloid toxicity. Some lovely work from the Gladstone group in San Francisco. And at a more biophysical level, it turns out that the ApoE4 molecule forms a molten globule protein conformation at lysosomal pH that is absent in ApoE3, and this is an absolutely unique conformation of human ApoE4 that is not documented in ApoE3 and is not documented in species which have the chimpanzee type substitutions. So this is a candidate for a unique human evolutionary adaptation or a change in the ApoE molecule, and it may, the question is, what is its role, and it may have something to do with resistance to infection. More about that in a minute. So developmentally, ApoE alleles also are coming into serious discussion in brain. Here's a targeted replacement of mice with E3 versus E4, and it turns out that the E4 mice have much less complex cortical neurons, and their excitatory transmission has a different pharmacology than the E3 containing. This is a mouse, but here it is in humans from Judith Rappaport and others. An MRI study on kids in Bethesda shows that E3 carriers have thicker entorhinal cortex than E4 carriers. This gets really scary because, of course, this makes it a target of eugenic elective abortion. So all these benefits from E3, why could there be E4? There's now several studies that I think are quite good surgical pathology studies showing that E4 carriers with hepatitis have less hepatic damage and fewer liver crises than E3. And there's, I have 3 minutes? Good. And then there's, so this suggests that in fact ApoE4 under some circumstances could be under balancing selection for resistance to organ damage in some types of infections. There's some evidence that this is also true for cerebral malaria and development in Brazilian slums where there's chronic diarrhea. And then there's an emerging literature, surgical literature, that E4 carriers have higher acute phase responses afterwards. So there's a basis for thinking then seriously that the introduction of E4 evolutionarily in human ancestors might have been adaptive in highly infectious and traumatic situations where this would have higher levels of host defenses that in a more modest and less challenging environment that we now are in the mid-20th century onwards, then the deleterious effects came out. But this does not begin to address the complexity of how this would interact with human brain development and human evolution. So open questions, of course, to consider what other gene differences influence metabolism and blood lipids in different dietary regimes. How does this what genes in the other genes in immune function do we need to consider? And Ajit Varki has some wonderful candidates. I hope he talks about those. And major question is why, or in fact, do old chimpanzees and other great apes have less Alzheimer's damage? And then some really interesting questions about adipose tissue biology. All of the cave art from 30,000 years ago until into the Neolithic, that's no longer cave, features women who are very amply endowed with fat stores, which of course would be adaptive for nursing over extended times if there were fluctuations in food. But I'd also like to point out that great apes don't develop much fat deposits at puberty. Breasts only really evolve later in pregnancy, and so we're quite unique in this. So there's a wonderful package of evolutionary biology that links fat, diet, genes, and longevity, and I hope to be around a few more years to work on some of this.
We ended up on time at 3 o'clock. The Robert Sapolsky is not here, but we will just move Randy Nessie up so that he will take his place, and so hopefully the summing up will be a little earlier than is on the sheet here. So you're invited to eat and drink either side, please, and I'm assured there is the same amount of resource on either side.